Great. So I think that I've titled this Sharing Data in the AnVIL, Making Research Data Products Useful and Fair. I think that's one thing that we want to talk about. So I will do a high-level overview talking about some of the principles of why are we even bothering to talk about this, and then I'll dive into some real details about how you might want to submit and what that could look like. So the first question, what are we trying to do? Right? I think fair data is very important, and really especially when it comes to data models and data submission, we're trying to accomplish a few things, right? With FAIR, that F2 is really important. Data are described with rich metadata. That's the purpose of a data model. That's why we need it. Again, there's a lot of clear and explicit identifiers being used. Those metadata can be registered or indexed. It can be available, and again, they're using that shared, broadly applicable language for knowledge representation. So that's another thing about standards. And so it's really important where we can to be able to align with existing standards, to use existing terminologies and ontologies to represent that data. So I think FAIR, again, is really at the heart of what we're trying to do. And so I think, the purpose of data model is communication. That's what we're doing, right? It's about FAIR. It's about all those aspects. But of course, it's more complicated than that. It's more challenging than that. If we're asking questions about what data model should I use or how should I submit data, there's obviously more that we need to dive into. I think we all know that human communication is really hard. Talking between people, there's lots of opportunities for miscommunication. And there's a lot of that we take for granted. I think that's one of the things you might learn about early on in a scientific training. Is it like, remember your audience hasn't been doing the things you've been doing for 2 years, like in that lab. They may have great fundamentals, but they don't know all the things that you've had to do. And so it's easy to forget that sometimes, right? And so what we use for these standards information tools, right? There's ideas about language, including the vocabulary and syntax, formats, right? You have formal agendas and you have short forms, too long didn't read, abbreviations that may make sense in some contexts and not in others. And then again, those contexts, right? That history and nonverbal communication even can be really important. And I think this is why, the large language models are so important. Some of the historic NLP has been really hard because it's easy to miss some of those pieces that they aren't explicitly stated. And so it's really important that we're being very explicit when we're defining our data models and sharing those. And I think we all get stressed out when it comes to things like writing resumes or turning in assignments or presenting reports, right? And part of that is to make sure that we're really actually sharing what we want to do, right? And I think sometimes we end up, and we know this as humans, like the idea of breaking these expectations can be those recipes for humor, or embarrassment, or miscommunications. Again, depending on the setting, that may be a good or bad thing to kind of break those expectations down. So I think these are all important pieces to consider, that we want to align on all those layers, right? And so I think slides are a really helpful example. And so I'm doing this meta example here, right? You know what bullet points on a slide mean, most likely, right? You know that each of these are major points and they've got subpoints. And I'm using sort of this Latin script with American English, and it all makes sense. It's Unicode, right? The title is telling you what we're talking about in the context space, and the conversation here is about standards and communication. And so, right, I think if you just got the title of the slide, example slide, you wouldn't have any idea what that is. But because the context of the presentation, it makes sense about why I'd have an example slide and what that could mean. And again, with the content itself, you can generally interpret it. But then if I go, and this is actually an image of wingdings, and you can't tell what it means, right? And I think this is that space of like how you encode it. You can't, for example, you couldn't even go and copy this text out and translate it. That's bad. And I think that's something we really need to consider when we're building this out. And anchoring it more concretely, right, you have this example data table, and it's a little bit extreme, but I think this is what we're thinking about when we're talking about data models and why it's so important. I've seen people share data like this before. I get data like this, and it's not usable functionally, right? There's a lot of different inconsistencies, and I won't make you all try and spot the inconsistencies here, but you look at, right, that measurement, that creatinine. Well, some have units, some don't. Sometimes there's this less than 5 in there. That's interesting. The dates are all in different formats. The IDs look inconsistent, right? And I guess the next slide we'll talk about through this. What information is baked into that ID? Is that useful? What type of creatinine is it? What type of units? Like, what's going on? And so that's all really important. And I think when we're articulating our data models, we need to make sure that we're covering these use cases, and the data that we provide is really consistent. I think dates are, maybe not as relevant in AnVIL as, it could be considered PHI, and we don't necessarily want to share that in typical settings. But if you do need to have dates, right, sticking with a common format, I always advocate for ISO 8601 as a date format, and that's that top format because it's unambiguous, very clear, sorts well. And so I think those little things can actually have a really big impact because you can misinterpret like that middle date. Which is month, which is day, which is year. So how do we make sure we're all on the same page? I think another area that the specificity can be really important is this example about absence of evidence. When you have missingness in your tables, it's really important to define why it's missing, right? In this example I pulled from Fire, this is a value set to say why is the data not present in this field? And these distinctions can be really important, right? That question of, well, did you ask a participant and they declined to answer? That's very different from you didn't ask them. Or, oh, they answered, but I couldn't actually structure the answer because we don't have the right codes for it. And so I think that's very important to be able to specify. And people who want to use your data are really going to need to know that. And so there's a lot of different terms that we throw out here, and I'm going to kind of breeze through this a little bit, but the idea is these are all kind of important. They're all slightly different. And when we're talking, I really want to say we're talking about data models and data dictionaries. I think those are the most important. That's what we're talking about submitting. And so, right, when we're thinking about this here, it's this kind of logical data model. You want an implementable definition of a data representation. That's really what we want. We want somebody able to look at it and say, yes, I know what this means. I know what data is supposed to be here. And those entities, attributes, or relationships are well defined and well described. There's also this idea of information model, could be a little vague, may not actually be able to be implementable, but it can be helpful to understand things, but that's not really our focus. The other one is data dictionaries, right? And so this is, it's a defined as a specific table of data, right? And like the data model, I need to be able to know what the fields are, what values they can have. Are there any constraints? That's really important to interpretability, right? Those well-defined data dictionaries are unambiguous, and the data can be validated for conformance, right? And there are common poorly defined data dictionaries that say, oh yeah, there's a field, it's called name, and it's a string. That's fine, but it doesn't actually, it may help the human side, but it doesn't necessarily solve the technical side, and both are important. Right, and there's lots of modeling languages that can be used here. And I think as long as what you're providing is clear, again, we're typically using some sort of basic spreadsheet defined data dictionaries. And you also might see DDLs, right? And that can be important. That's a nice technical tool, but they don't always include the depth of information you want about descriptions and helping humans. So it's kind of the opposite problem you might have with that loosely specified DD. So I think one thing that we want to think about here is part of what we're trying to do is manage the complexity. Each researcher does a project on a specific topic, and what's important to them might be different than what's important to someone else. And so we really want to kind of boil that up to that common layer. Everyone's representing something kind of similar. And so I think this is what we're really trying to help people think about and help people target if submitting data to the AnVIL. We want to find that level of agreement and right approach. So I just think that's going to be really important. So the common interfaces there can be really helpful, but also that, and they kind of help it so you don't have to have always that deep understanding and agreement of exactly what was done and what was being used, right? And I think one example of that, it can be useful to be able to share, oh, this person had type 2 diabetes from this study, and that person had type 2 diabetes from the other study. That's still useful, even if the data were collected in different ways. Maybe some were pulled from electronic health records, maybe some were asked the participant directly. It's good to know that metadata, and that should be available. But when it comes to sharing utility, maybe that's not the depth that you need. And I think, practically speaking, a lot of times there could be differences that aren't really meaningful, right? There's technical differences in what happens in a DBMS, right? When you've got a CAR 15 versus a VAR 15. But practically speaking, for most people using the data and consuming that, it doesn't matter. And so we really want to try and find that sweet spot to say, hey, I really need to be specific. I need to know that this is character text, but maybe when I'm consuming it, maybe I don't need to know that the limit you had was 15. Maybe it is important. Maybe if you had a lot of, you ran out of space a lot, you would want to share that. But I think that's what we're trying to do. So how do we get there then? We kind of know the grounding. We know that there's a lot of differences in data that's being shared, and we want to get together. Well, again, I think we have these two big objectives to have good data sharing and be fair. Again, it's about making sure that data is clear and well specified, and then conforming to an existing standard to make exchanging easy. We may not always get to the second one, but we absolutely must have the first. That clear and well-specified data, again, it's about that well-defined data dictionary, and then the data has to conform with that dictionary, right? If you're telling everyone, hey, this has to be a number, and then you have text in it, you're kind of letting everybody down. And that's just no good. It's no good for anybody. And so we need you to provide data dictionaries. They need to be consistent. And we're working with you all to make sure, and submitters to improve our process and make sure that those things do conform, that they are consistent with what we share. And so when you're writing a data dictionary, we really want to think about, does it include the details that help a human understand the data? Again, that's about maybe column descriptions are a great way to do that. And then does it include the details to help a computer to understand the data, right? And those are where those types and coded terms you could submit come in. And so the data dictionaries I'll share later do both of these things, which is great and really important. So I encourage you to be thinking about how both of those are important. And then again, for the data, does it actually conform? That it's got to. Otherwise, maybe the data is wrong, maybe the data dictionary is wrong, but if they're inconsistent, somebody is sort of misleading you or misleading the consumers, whether it's the data or the data dictionary. So you need to iterate until they are consistent. Data standards are also a really powerful way to help speed up the process. Most of the time you'll find that the data models use a lot of the same general concepts. You have this idea of a participant or a subject. Those participants and subjects have some types of biospecimens that were provided. Maybe they have some files that contain genomic data that were associated. Maybe those individuals had some set of health conditions, which is why they were of interest to be studied. And so I think you'll find that many of these data models might fit your needs, even if it's not exactly how you would have thought about it originally. Most data models in this space kind of end up talking about these sort of common entities. And we'll go through some of the details of the models, but at a quick high-level overview, you can go to the AnVILproject.org page with the guidance on data model submission. You can look at the AnVIL findability subset. If you're working with healthcare data, for example, from EHRs or other longitudinal observational data, the OMOP common data model is a widely adopted tool or data model with many tools that come with it that might help you and might be suitable for your work. I also highlight the Gregor Consortium. I'm not directly affiliated with them, but I think they have done a really great job in defining a data model for their rare disease research. There might be a little bit of a simplification, but that kind of space. In the past, we've worked with the Centers for Mendelian Disease Genomics to set up a data model that kind of met the needs across the centers. Again, I think the Gregor one is an upgrade from that, but it's another potential opportunity. Places like Phoenix provide validated data capture instruments, which again can be really well specified. Those clear answers, clear questions, what's going on. And so if you provide data right from Phoenix or from the NLM Common Data Element Repository, those can be good targets. I realize there's work that's being asked here to get up to this higher level of data standards, but it really does make a difference. It really does make your data more usable. Yeah, and so I think, I left something out here. Well, maybe we'll talk about it later, but I think getting to those standards is really important. And I think starting as early as you can is also really important. When you want to capture data, again, think about using these validated capture instruments. If you need to capture, social drivers of health, why would you make something up? When you can go to find these, well-funded resources where someone has already tested it and someone's already asked those questions and understood, how the quality of responses they get back. So I encourage you to start early and collect data in ways that are going to be compatible, using structured codes and ontologies. So again, what makes a successful model is about facilitating clear communication of the data. And really, you maybe won't have everything perfect, but most of these common data models really focus on covering most of the data in a well-specified domain. They're describing what is in the model and how to express it. I think OMOP does a great job of actually having a lot of conventions that say, hey, if you're trying to express this, here's what you should use. Or if you're trying to find this data, here's where it might live in the model. I think that's really great. And the goal is to have little room for ambiguity or differing representation of the same ideas. So it should be really clear there's one way to express something and it's very clear. That's really ideal. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples here, including the AnVIL findability subset right now. And I hope these are helpful and we'll get some insight into what's going on. So the OMOP common data models, this is with tables, vocabularies, and conventions that allow standardization of the observational health data. I think it's really targeted as an analytic data model. which means that it's really powerful when you want to do analysis. It's not trying to represent all the data exactly and precisely the way it was captured necessarily, but it is trying to present it in a way that's really useful. So it's pretty complicated, potentially, right? You see the left items in blue there are really about the row level data about participants, but that orange column there, those are all the vocabularies that they've incorporated. And I think that's something that OMOP, part of what makes it so powerful is that the teams have curated that set of vocabularies to say, these are the terms we want you to use. It is somewhat restrictive at times. You can't express everything in those vocabularies. But at the same time, for those commonly used ones, it's very powerful, strongly organized. So again, and you notice when you look through, we have these ideas of person, we have ideas about conditions again, and measurements. I think, again, those common elements are here present and available. And the vocabulary itself, right, has a lot of different details that are available. Again, I think it's really neat. And you don't have to do this. Like, you just get it for free if you use OMOP. There are a lot of vocabularies out there that you can also get for free, and we'll talk about some examples of how you might use those in other data models as well. And they use these different categories of concepts, and these are just tools to help you consume OMOP. There's also a lot of good training for OMOP out there. There's some great videos if you go to the odyssey.org. You can check something. You can look at those and learn a lot about it. Yeah, and again, I think this is about, by mapping all these codes into the standard vocabularies, it makes it really easy to use. And again, this is the goal, and this is part of what we're thinking about across the AnVIL. Each of these studies, each the submitters, right? The goal is that everyone conforms to that same data model. You can really apply some of those same methods across the studies and get consistent results. And so it's definitely true. This is true not just of OMOP, but of all these things. Those data sources might look different, but if we can get to this consistent format, it really does make life easier for you if you want to combine your data with others, but also for those secondary users. Another model I want to talk about is a Gregor data model. And so this is a high-level view from their GitHub. It covers a lot of the same elements about participants and biosamples, and then the analysts, and then what experiments are done and what files there are. It also includes some elements about that I didn't cover, that aren't covered in that particular diagram, about conditions. And when you go look at, this is the participant view here, and we look at it, it's very similar to what you'd see in the other models, right? You have this, great, we have the participant identifiers. We have, sometimes there's internal project IDs. You have enumerations. We have a list of possible Gregor centers. And so that's where the sequencing was done, I believe. You have things about the consent codes that are recorded on an individual level. You might recognize these, from dbGaP. And so I think this is a really good snapshot here of what type of information are they capturing. These aren't the same, likely, for any of you. If you're not a Gregor study, the Gregor center won't be the same. And that's okay. You don't necessarily have to use that field if you wanted to adopt the Gregor data model, but it's there, and maybe you'd have something similar if you have a multi-center study. But again, I think it's well specified. We have types, we have any references out there, we've got good human readable descriptions, there's examples, and there's explicit lists of what terms are allowed. So it's really meets a lot of those criteria we're talking about. This is about the phenotypes, and so you can look and see, a very similar thing. We have these references here, so we say, oh, this is referencing participant IDs. That's really helpful. So I know that, oh yeah, this is how these tables go together. And then again, with these enumerations, there's also this opportunity to provide these ontology codes, right? And so one of the really powerful things thinking of the Gregor model is saying, hey, you should really use the human phenotype ontology or the monarch disease ontology when you're talking about these different these conditions that someone might have, these phenotypes that someone might have. And so again, they've got a list of enumerations they support, and these are a list of ontologies they support. And the goal here, like I said, is to make it more consistent, because even across Gregor, you really want to be precise about those terms. And if there is a standardized ontology, you can get a lot of benefit from pulling those terms out. There's a lot of tables in here. This is a high-level view that you can't read. But I think the idea, again, at that core, you really start to see some of the same elements, right? Participants and their phenotypes. That's all the same kinds of things, very similar to what you'd find in OMOP or find in the AnVIL findability subset. And I encourage you, I've got a lot of good resources you can check out. They are a version 1.6 of the data model. This is all totally open. If you're interested to go look and see, I provided links in there. With their README here, you can go to the GitHub and kind of keep an eye on their progress. And they've got links to all the different versions, so you can see how it's changed over time. It's really powerful. Same thing with the OMOP common data model. There's an enormous set of really useful tools here. We can go look at different versions. You can look at, they've got how-tos, and they've got a lot of tools available for use. The AnVIL findability subset is a great tool. And so this is something that AnVIL is actually using internally right now to aggregate the data across studies. You know, again, these entities that are picked here look very similar, like just what we've been talking about before. You have this idea of donors or participants, you have their specimens or biosamples, you know, you have conditions or phenotypes, all of that's here. So again, this is the high level overview. This is something, another option that we could encourage you to submit with. So if we were to look at the donor table, we see a very similar pattern about their data dictionary, right? We've got column names and we've got high level human readable names and descriptions. We have how required the fields are, data types, and additionally, those list of suggested coding systems, which again, I think is really important. So oftentimes, you know, you might think, well, why do I need to go into NCBI, you know, taxonomy and go find Homo sapiens to talk about my human samples? Yeah, and maybe is it a little complicated? It took me a couple minutes to find the right one. But you know what? Like that means that when somebody has, you know, a mouse specimen in there too for a model organism, it's actually easy and findable and you can understand. You can start to do some logic there. So I encourage you to go ahead and use these things. It can be intimidating, I agree, when you first look at them, but I think it can be actually really helpful. You know, it's not just about your study context and what makes sense there. It's about how do we make sure that that's consistent and usable across studies. You know, file's another one, and this is something you need to submit anyway. We need that file manifest. If you have a lot of sequencing files in there, we have to know who they're linked to, like what does that file belong to? And there may not be a lot of good info. It may be kind of hard to link without this. So these kinds of things are super critical, even operationally, to make sure that all your data is captured consistently and made available to researchers. Conditions, again, like I said, I think you'll see this is very similar to what was available in Gregor. And there's opportunities here to describe those human readable places if you have labels that you want to put in or ways you capture data. But also, I think perhaps more importantly, or very important to me at least, you have that same idea. If you need a code in a coding system, it's much more fair if you don't just have a free text term, right? If your metadata is actually structured, if those row level data elements actually point to a standardized ontology, it's way easier for everyone else to use. You can put it, like if we have a column called T2D, we can guess that means type 2 diabetes. It might say that in the column description, but if you don't have that structured term, it's going to be a lot of work for everyone else to kind of say, oh, well, it's a T2D over here, and it's type 2 diabetes over here, and it's diabetes mellitus comma type 2 over here. That makes it really hard to use for everyone. And so if we can anchor to those terms, not only does it make it more consistent, but then you can start to get into the fun that is leveraging the ontologies to actually do computation, to be able to group. Well, now I can also group diabetes type 1 and diabetes type 2, which, you know, it can be a lot harder to do if you just have free text strings. So again, I think this is a great opportunity to be able to provide that. And you see in here, there's opportunities to say true and false. Sometimes, right, you might be you have a case and control cohort. So that's a really important element to capture. And that's something that's present in the Gregor data model as well. You know, we're continuing to develop these approaches to try and make this shared data more consistent and more useful across studies. And so that's something that we're continuing to do on the AnVIL team. So we'd be glad to hear about those pain points or things that you'd want to include that maybe on support for or have questions about. As is, right, you know, there's nothing in that AnVIL findability subset that specifically talks about measurements like height and weight. That's okay, right? You can still add that, supplement that to the data model. I think it's something we'd like to add for everyone. But yeah, definitely don't be restricted by what's in that model when you want to submit data. You can provide more data, but if you have data that are in those shared elements, by conforming to the standard, they make it much easier for other people to use and consume the data. So I highly encourage you to do that. Yeah, so at the end of the day, go to the AnVILproject.org site. There's a link here in the slides, which I can share in the chat in just a minute, to setting up a data model. There's some directions here, some instructions, some ideas about what to consider. You can go to this link to find info about the AnVIL findability subset. This is here. Again, it's very similar data dictionary. There's a lot of good document overview talking about how to work with the data model. This is all here and available, as well as all these tabs. So I encourage you to go in and read more if you're interested. Yeah, and this is what I was putting on earlier, but I'll reiterate. The best time to implement a standard is before you start data collection, but the second best time is now. So I know it's work, and no one wants to go back and have to rejigger to conform. But I think the reality is the utility that you get, the how much people will be able to use your data once you've shared it just goes so much higher whenever you are consistent with other data. It makes that just so much easier. Um, so again, sharing the best form of your data is good for you, is good for everyone. And I encourage you, especially if you're thinking about planning your study and how you want to capture, record that data, to really be thinking about using standards from the get-go. So I think that closes out what I had to present on today. Of course, happy to answer any questions about this topic. And then I think there's also an opportunity for any open questions about the AnVIL at large.